you need to listen to your heart as much as your mind and balance those. And I think a lot of entrepreneurs have this dilemma. Like if you look at the logic behind being an entrepreneur, it doesn't make a lot of logical sense because your chance of failure is very high. But a lot of people, I mean, including yourselves, you can ask yourself this, like a lot of entrepreneurs I know can't imagine themselves working for anyone else. Like it just emotionally is like very, very difficult for them to accept. And so you make that choice, but then you have to also know what the consequences are and be prepared for that.
Welcome to The Wild Show with your hosts, Will Chang, Lee Chang, and Andrew Su. Hi, this is Will Chang, and as always, I have my co-host Lee Chang here with me.
Good to be on.
Today, our guest is our friend Brian Wong. Brian is a Chinese-American entrepreneur and investor. He was the first American and the 52nd employee to join Alibaba Group, where he contributed to the company's early globalization efforts and served as Jack Ma's special assistant for international affairs. During his 16-year tenure, Brian established the Alibaba Global Initiatives Division and was the founder and executive director of the Alibaba Global Leadership Academy. Brian is the author of the Tao of Alibaba, Inside the Chinese Digital Giant That Changed the World, a book that outlines the blueprint of the company's management philosophy. Brian is also the founder and chairman of Radii, a digital media platform dedicated to bridging understanding between East and West by providing a window into Chinese youth culture. Welcome, Brian.
Thanks a lot, gentlemen.
So reading your book, The Tao of Alibaba, I felt a deep sense of connection with you, and I'm sure Lee did too, because both of us went to China in our 20s, seeking adventure and opportunity, and also wrestled with our identity. I think it's incredibly impressive, the path that you carved out for yourself. I'm sure Lee has also many, many questions. But before we get started on that, I wanted to start from the beginning. Your parents were born in the United States. Your mother's parents owned fruit farms in Sacramento. Your dad was a doctor. So your ties to China didn't seem that strong growing up. What do we need to know for us to understand what drew you to China in the beginning?
Thanks, Will and Lee, for having me on today. It's really great to be part of this podcast. And your first question, I think, is a good one. It lays the context. As you mentioned, I'm like third and a quarter generation because surprisingly, even my maternal grandmother was born in the US. So we go back a long ways. And I grew up in the Bay Area. Most of my childhood, I was one of the few Chinese Americans in my schools and the neighborhood. But what was really interesting is my parents always taught me to have great respect and appreciation for my heritage. And I always harbored this curiosity and interest in learning more about my Chinese roots. So I lived in Palo Alto, but we'd go to San Francisco, and going to like Chinatown in San Francisco was always a treat of sights and sounds because there's just so much to take in, and like food and the visuals. And I said, gosh, how do I learn more about this? So by the time I got to college, even though I was studying other things like sciences and was on a track to kind of go into medicine, I spent like 3 of my 4 summers in China. One was studying the language in Beijing. Another one was in Kunming teaching English. And then I spent some time in Hong Kong. And by the time I got out of college, I was supposed to go to med school. I said, let me take another year and do grad school in Nanjing. And that sort of sealed my fate. Like I had enough kind of exposure at that point where I couldn't really get away from it. So that really shaped the trajectory kind of my life after college. And that's kind of the origins of my interest in China.
So when you went to Nanjing, I know you were still thinking about becoming a doctor at that time, right?
Yeah.
So what changed?
Well, I justify it. In Nanjing, my thesis was on like healthcare and health policy and how the open door reforms impacted healthcare access. Sounds really boring, I know at this point, but it was something that I thought could tie my interest in public health in an emerging market, which was China. I came to this realization that besides just being a doctor and helping patient by patient, which I think is a very distinguished and admirable career, there are ways you can change people's lives for the better in other ways. Surprisingly, business, the inward investment that was taking place in China was raising the quality of people's lives. I always had like a chip on my shoulder. I thought business was just like pure greed, and I never thought I would go into business. But once I saw how China was changing and how you contrast like people's lives in the villages versus in the cities, but also the trajectory in which society was changing because of the economic development. And frankly, like just seeing how business was changing aspects of people's lives every day in everyday ways, I said, well, maybe that's not so bad. but it got me on a track of kind of curiosity and discovery in terms of what will be the best career to impact people's lives in the most positive way. So business was one of them, but I also saw how government was changing that, the role of policy. And so I think it kind of freed me from the shackles of just pursuing a single track for a career opportunity.
So in the book, one of the things that really stood out to me was that around 1999, you received an email from Joe Tsai recruiting you to join Alibaba. So today, if you look on Wikipedia, Joe Tsai is a billionaire. He's the chairman of Alibaba, and he's the owner of the Brooklyn Nets, among other professional teams. What did you do to make such a good impression on him for him to recruit you like that?
Well, so Joe is, I mean, for those who know him or have met him, he's a very down to earth person. He's very thoughtful in whatever he says or does. And he's someone that I respected when I met him. I met him before he decided to co-found Alibaba with Jack. So we were in touch. And when he decided to embark on the Alibaba adventure, a mutual friend kind of told me, hey, Joe's looking to hire people for this new startup. You should talk to him. So I think the best thing that I did was just not embarrass myself in front of him. I didn't offend him. I didn't hopefully make a bad impression. Alibaba at the time, I think they were just looking for able bodies who had international experience, who were willing to join a company that had very little reputation, barely had a website up and running, but had a big idea. So I was in San Francisco at the time working for Mayor Willie Brown. Like, as I said, I was going through my journey of self-discovery. So I went from consulting into kind of city politics. But growing up in Palo Alto, I had a very strong belief and confidence in the role that technology could play. So when Joe reached out and said, hey, I'm in town, let's meet up. I've got this founder, Jack Ma, who I also think you should meet. I said, okay. And when we met, it was really like this combination of tech plus China as the emerging market, plus what I thought of as a time a very viable business model, really convinced me that, hey, this is a great company to join. And I was very fortunate that Joe was willing to take me on and say, okay, Brian, why don't you join us at that time?
I know Joe really had like a very prestigious background. So Jack Ma recruited him to kind of become like the expertise to help him build the
Yeah.
company, right?
Yeah.
And so this is still really early on in your career. And so you probably had a little bit of experience, but not a lot. And so
Yeah.
just for somebody that in that position, how do you get somebody like Joe to recruit you?
I think it's really about timing. It's about personality fit, and it's about persistence and just willingness to kind of put yourself out there. So I was at a stage where I was just trying to ask a lot of questions to anyone that would be willing to sit down and talk to me. And Joe, as you said, was from a very prestigious background. He had great pedigree in terms of education. He worked in Wall Street as a lawyer at a buyout firm. He was working at that time at Investor AB, which is the Wallenberg family, very prestigious private equity. If I knew just how prestigious, and his family is very well-known legal family in Taiwan. If I'd known all that, I probably would have been even more sort of hesitant or a little intimidated. At the same time, I think of it as an opportunity to learn from people. So I think one thing you learn in life is that curiosity will get you places that you expect least, just because the sincerity is there in terms of wanting to learn. And I think Joe probably saw me as a young kid who had an open mind and was adventurous and willing to do things that most people that want to follow a traditional track aren't going to be willing to do. I mean, think about it. In 1999, who would be willing to leave Silicon Valley in its heyday to go join a company in the outskirts of a second tier city in China? I mean, you guys have lived in China. Just imagine what it was like that time. I tell people like a good meal for me in Hangzhou at the time was like KFC or like Pizza Hut. Going to the salad bar was like a treat. So that's the kind of life I was living. But that's maybe why he hired me. It's like, okay, this guy's willing to tough it out.
Yeah. So, I mean, he brought you to meet Jack Ma. And at the time, Alibaba only had 30 users. I mean, 30,000 users at the
3,000.
time.
Yeah.
30,000. Yeah. So what was your initial impression of him, Jack Ma?
Well, so Jack, he showed up with Joe. He's kind of a smaller person in stature, but he kind of emanates this energy and charisma. And he came in with a big smile and he just had a lot of confidence in what he was doing. And it's kind of like, look, this is what we're going to do. We're going to make it happen. And I really believe this. But it was also not like in some aggressive, intimidating way. It was like in a very warm and charismatic way, to the point where he's like, look, this is what I'm doing. You want to be a part of it because we're going to go places. And it's almost like gives you this big bear hug and like, hey, come on, this is going to be fun. So it's hard to kind of resist that. And even though I had, to be honest, you look at the website back then, you're just thinking, this does not look like a professional company. When you combine Joe's professionalism with Jack's charisma, you're like, well, maybe we have a shot because what they're laying out sounds very compelling.
So obviously, I mean, today, Alibaba isn't just what Alibaba was before. There's so many different facets of it, whether it's Alipay or Taobao or things like that, right? How much of the vision did Jack Ma have at that time for the entire operation?
So he definitely had a vision in terms of conceptually where he wanted to go. I still remember to this day, back in 2000, he laid out this idea of meet at Alibaba, work at Alibaba, live at Alibaba. And I thought that was quite clever because seemed so encompassing, but it also gave you sort of a roadmap in terms of where the company could go. But the first step was meet at Alibaba. And we were just an information platform trying to create connections. And we were doing that in a way that was pretty amazing because I remember, there's all these stories about how these wholesale buyers and sellers were creating connections across the world. And I'd host these events and stories people would tell about friendships being made or how the platform connected them to these opportunities that changed their lives. It was pretty compelling. But then when it gets to work at Alibaba, that's when you get things like payment and logistics and actual real commerce. And then the live has really come alive through like media and healthcare and things that we didn't know exactly what the businesses were going to be, but that kind of roadmap actually helped us kind of see where we could go. So, and then there's a lot of other examples of what Jack kind of laid out in terms of vision. He always talked about Alibaba becoming the infrastructure of international trade, of commerce in the domestic China market. So he'd lay the broad strokes and then it was up to us to kind of figure out what exactly that meant. And I think that is his talent as a leader, is to help people visualize and then allow them to do what they need to do.
So you mentioned that it was kind of the perfect storm of both Joe having that expertise, the professionalism, and then the passion, the vision of Jack. At this time for you, was it also, given like your experiences in China, you were already pouncing or looking to pounce on an opportunity? Like you couldn't wait to get back out there? Or you were like, I've been there, done that, it's interesting, but wasn't something that you just felt like this was kind of your calling in life?
Good question. What's funny, every time I would go back to the US, because there were 2 times I left China and went back for other jobs. There was always in the back of my mind this itch to kind of get returned to China because I felt like I might be missing out. There was some FOMO going on, mainly because I knew how quickly China was changing and evolving. I won't lie, like I got very comfortable being back in the US on some level, the first time in San Fran and the second time in New York. But when I looked at, in the case of San Francisco, it was, do I take the route of like politics and choose that path? Because the mayor had just gone up for reelection and we got him reelected and he was up for a second term. That's 4 years. And I was really enjoying kind of being in the mix of local politics. And my dream was like, oh, maybe I could be the first Chinese American mayor of San Francisco, given how many Chinese actually lived in San Fran. Ed Lee was my colleague, the first actual Chinese American mayor. He was the head of purchasing. So none of us thought that it would come anytime soon, but like, why not make that a goal? Or go back to China and kind of be part of that. And then with New York, it was looking at the multinational I was working in, how long or how many years it would take to get back to China within that organization versus just go back, rejoin Alibaba. So I always worried that window of opportunity in China was going to close if I stayed out too long. And I think that's what pulled me back.
It's interesting because if you look at every single company in China, really the story of Alibaba is ultimately the story about the rise of China. And you've called Jack Ma the Forrest Gump of China, right? And I was hoping maybe you could lay out where China was in 1999 and basically as Alibaba was growing and building its businesses, did it help enable for China to basically grow and how did it lead to the rise of China?
Yeah, so I think the Forrest Gump analogy is really good because in a way, Jack was sort of, like you said, writing the China story. And he was sort of a bystander that happened to be there, but kind of got caught in the middle of everything each time it happened. And I think that Jack knew that these things were happening. He sensed it. He's got strong intuition. And he also knew that technology was going to be a catalyst. So since 1994, 1995, he's been pushing the internet. He saw it at a distance because of his trip to the US and said, this is going to happen regardless. He always used to say, and these are recorded conversations, like, if it's not me that brings the internet to China, someone will, but I might as well try my best to do it. So I would say like the three are kind of some of the key trends that Jack Ma in Alibaba rode was one, the modernization of China in terms of its industrialization for manufacturing, but more specifically, the export economy. That was the first kind of real wave to kind of drive this growth. And then there was the movement of kind of this domestic consumption, which was Taobao. So export economy was B2B, Alibaba.com. Domestic consumption wave was Taobao. And then you had this kind of financial development of the system, which was digital payments, which was Alipay. Then you had globalization, China's globalization, which was not just the export of products, but the shift in terms of import. And that was Tmall and Tainiao. And then you had this great wealth creation that then started to go to the rural areas in the second, third, fourth tier cities. And that was rural Taobao. So each one of these, Alibaba played a key role actually in catalyzing it. And Jack just happened to be there. And because he was ready for it, because he was also running in the same direction, he was really able to kind of capitalize on that. What's really interesting, though, is that there was a woman back in late 1999, 2000. She was a journalist from Zhejiang. She was already following Jack. When I joined Alibaba in the end of 1999, she already had camera crews following him for like a year or two, charting his story. And I always thought that was strange. Like, he's not even famous yet. Why are you doing this? But she already sensed that there was something that was happening. And then another great example of Jack and how he just ends up in the middle of all this, before he even became an entrepreneur, I think maybe when he was an English teacher or something, or maybe even a student, CCTV did this TV show looking at people's behavior. And they ran this like experiment where they had these guys who were acting as thieves and they were stealing a manhole cover off the street. And they filmed what people's reactions were. And Jack happened to be riding by on a bicycle and he saw this and he went up to the guys. He got off his bike and he ran up to the guys and said, "You can't do this." And these guys were like, "Mind your own business," because they'd steal the manhole covers so they can melt down the metal and sell it. That was like black market business. At least that was the storyline. And Jack said, "No, you can't do this because if you steal this manhole cover, it's going to be very dangerous and people could fall into the hole and get hurt or even die." And they actually filmed this, right? They have it on the TV show. And that is like just a sign of like Jack was already in the limelight and he was already in a kind of espousing his beliefs and kind of social values and how you need to take care of your community. So it's interesting because even at a young age, Jack was already kind of there in the center. And then as China developed, he was part of this story, like you said. Anyhow, long answer to your question.
Well, that was really helpful. And since you started Alibaba, you were the 52nd employee in 1999. And then 15 years later, in 2014, you were still with Jack Ma. You were Jack Ma's chief of staff. And at this point, you were helping Jack Ma with the Alibaba's investor roadshow that ultimately led to Alibaba going public on the New York Stock Exchange. And so that rise was incredibly fast. And you're from the beginning all the way to the IPO. What was that experience like for you?
Well, I had a lot of moments where I had to stop and think, wow, how did we get here? And sometimes you run so fast, you forget. I actually kept a journal. I have like a whole stack of these that I kept because back in my mind, I always thought this would make an interesting story. For some reason, I also thought that I'm going to look back and need to tell this. And that intuition was right. But when we went on the road show, for me, it was like amazing because I was with the guy who kind of started the whole thing. And a lot of the things he said like 15 years before were all coming true. And it was just unfolding before my eyes. But on the roadshow specifically, what was crazy is like the people you'd meet, everyone from investment titans like Warren Buffett, Steve Schwarzman, Larry Fink. We met entrepreneurs like Zuckerberg, Gates, Branson, Michael Bloomberg. And then you meet presidents and prime ministers. I mean, all of them, like from Clinton to Obama. And then I'd never done this before. We literally met like kings and queens. I didn't know that whole concept still existed. So we met them and like sheikhs. And I think for me, it was like as a fly on the wall, like the guy that was just kind of carrying Jack's bag, just to witness this. It's like, wow, so this is how the world works. This is what people talk about. This is what's on their mind. It was mentally taxing and physically exhausting, but it was like one of the best real life education opportunities that I ever had. And it just happened that the IPO at that time was like the biggest ever in history. And There's so many things that I could share in terms of the stories from the roadshow and beyond. I would sort of summarize it high level in that way.
I'd love to jump a bit into back to Jack, just like his psyche, because you're one of the few people, probably the only person I know that works so closely with him. And to your point earlier about kind of the rise of China and the timing that everything happened with Alibaba, kind of both riding that wave, but also enabling it, right? Like in the book, you talk a lot about the decisions that were made. For example, eBay entering the market and such, catalyzing Taobao, and then Tmall, AliCloud, Cainiao. So I'm really curious because we always hear about, and kind of as you describe him, he's a man of vision, of utmost confidence. But working with him and being in private, like behind closed doors in those meetings, what was it like? Was he always so confident? And how did you guys kind of navigate these decision-making processes? Will and I spent time in China. And one thing that I think really resonated with us was just the speed at which things were happening and the speed at which things were changing. And you alluded to this a lot in your book too, right? Like you show up for work and it's like, okay, organize reorg. And it's like, okay, I got to go do everything all over again, right? So I'd love to hear a bit more about those times.
Yeah. So I was so curious about how Jack thinks, which is why I felt the opportunity to work as his special assistant chief of staff was a real treat. You always think that people have gurus or advisors and they kind of follow that structure. And I think many of us do at a young age. But when you get to his level, you start to have your own views. But Jack, what's most amazing about him is he synthesizes and he processes and then he kind of moves forward. And so it's not sitting there like reading some books and calling someone to give him his guidance. He's like just piecing it all together on his own. So I think one of the things that helps him a lot is he has a lot of smart people around him that he trusts. And so, like I said, he's got the vision, but then he will kind of consult those who are relevant to those issues and kind of bounce the ideas off and then also help him implement, like really, really set of loyal soldiers, not that are yes men, but that are just like, okay, let's battle this out, kind of discuss it, and then kind of just move forward once we decide. And so that's what allows him to move at light speed. But one of the crazy things, I remember 2014 or 15, this was a time when like streaming media was starting to really take off and it was this war of content versus distribution. Netflix, Hulu, all these were just starting to come out. But it's actually just before all that happened. I remember we met like with all these Hollywood executives, and it was actually just before we met the executives, but he was on the road and he's like, hey guys, let's get together. I got an idea for our new media business. And he just took on the back of a napkin and just started mapping this whole thing out. I'm the guy that's reading all like the analyst reports and all this like MBA-ish type stuff, but I don't think he reads any of that. But what he laid out was like above and beyond. So it was consistent with what the industry was talking about, but he had like all these other ideas that were just pretty forward looking to the point where I remember like, okay, wow, where did he get all this? But like a year later, that's kind of what the industry is saying should be done, like how you should vertically integrate these media businesses, how this content production will impact your leverage kind of within the business. And like everyone started investing in content creation, right? Like Netflix was doing their own original productions and Amazon went into this. This was before Amazon decided to go into content. He already laid that out. So the question is like, how on earth does a guy do this? And I just think it's this combination of the right people around him to provide perspective, but then his like convictions and his intuition. And he's always thinking about these things and he's always calling up people when he has ideas on his mind. And I think that's the rate and the pace at which he works. And then he has a team that can keep up.
So you said as you were going on the roadshow, you were the fly on the wall in between in meetings with very powerful, influential people that kind of run the world, right? Was there anything that you learned or you've taken away from that experience that you could share with us today?
I mean, there's a lot, but one thing I would say is if I were to meet with any of these people, I'd probably spend like hours prepping to figure out what I'm going to say to them. And he just goes into these very casually, but comes out with really interesting insights. But again, maybe it's because it's Jack Ma, like he created the company. So big difference. But I think the insight is that you got to be humble to really appreciate what those people can offer you. Like he never went in there and like lectured someone. He was as much interested in hearing what they had to say as him saying things. And people obviously asked him a million questions, but for him, it was like to take away a piece of knowledge and understanding. And I saw how he'd take that and then process it into the bigger picture. But he was always very interested in hearing and understanding a person. And then what I also noticed is he's able to read nonverbal cues very effectively. And like, he'll come away with something, not just from what they said, but also the metadata, so to speak. Right. And I think that comes from a person who has very street smart. Like Jack's formal education is not that sophisticated, but what he is sophisticated in is knowing how to read a room and knowing how to assess a person. He said within the first 15 minutes of a meeting, you already know where the meeting will go. He said the first 5 minutes is niceties. The next 10 minutes you're talking, you'll know already within that first 15 minutes what the meeting is going to be about, where it's going. And after 30 minutes, you've probably gotten the essence of what you need. It's like, damn, okay. That's why in Davos, they have these things called bilaterals. And sometimes they only last half an hour. I was like, yeah, what could you get done in half an hour? But I guess if you reach that level, you're able to kind of be very efficient. And he clearly mastered that. But it's not like he went and learned that in an MBA program. He's just intuition.
Yeah, the reason why it's so interesting to me too is just, I feel like when we see him on stage and talking about, Alibaba or his vision for the future of Alibaba, it's a lot of these espousing these large ideas and it's very grandiose. But then to your point about being behind closed doors and being analytical, I have an anecdote about that. Actually, I've been lucky enough to be in 2 meetings with him.
Oh,
When I
really?
worked at
Oh, great.
Foxconn. Yeah, I
Yeah.
was in the chairman's office for about 3 months. And so
Oh, perfect.
twice we had meetings in Beijing and
Yeah.
we were talking about partnering together on logistics. But the point was actually what you said earlier, I thought really struck a chord with me was how observant he was. And Terry Guo, the founder of Foxconn, is extremely animated, kind of a brother type of persona. And so I think Jack saw that and kind of gave him the spotlight, like in that meeting. He's like, you love that big brother mentality and you want to kind of lead this meeting, go ahead. Right. But I could tell the wheels were turning. I thought that was just super interesting because he became kind of, just very happy to let Terry take the lead on the meeting, but chime in when he felt like it was necessary. So that was very interesting for me.
It's a good observation. Yeah, I think that's definitely been my experience. And next time we talk, I want to ask you about Terry Guo.
Yeah. One of the things I had trouble with as an American, right, is the reading between the lines, right? Because I feel like Chinese is a much more contextual language, whereas English is you say what you mean generally, right? And so as an American, how did you learn or how did you observe kind of like how to pick up on those cues that American might not be able to pick up on?
It's definitely a challenge. Well, first of all, I would say I have not mastered that. I'm still probably clueless in many ways when kind of operating in China, but I definitely came to appreciate the same. Culturally, it's direct communication when it comes to certain things. And I think that just comes from experience and getting burned enough times. The Chinese custom is, like you said, to not be so confrontational. And even as an American, when I tried to get people to just lay it out, they would not do it. And even when you lay people off in a company, especially the more senior people, you kind of put them off to the side. You don't directly fire them. You put them off to the side and then kind of let them sit there without a lot to do. And then people get the message and then they'll quit and just fire the guy. But like part of it is respect, base. It's trying to avoid the confrontation. Obviously, sometimes you have to fire them because it's not efficient and you cost cutting. But I saw that the former happen quite a bit with some of the senior guys. So I don't know what the best way to adapt is, except that just to first be aware. And then it totally helps to study some Chinese philosophy, Taoism and Confucianism and Buddhism, not because you got to nerd out on that stuff, but just to understand the principles of thinking, because a lot of the locals, they won't be able to enunciate it in those terms because even they themselves are not aware of it, but it's internalized as part of the everyday culture. And so you could benefit from that. But more than anything, you've got to be aware and then you observe how certain people do it. And you say, okay, so that's what it is. And you'll see if certain things are said at a meeting and then the result is something else. Well, then you say, okay, so you connect the dots. And then the next time something like that happens, you sort of know, okay, this is how it works. But it's not easy. And that's probably one of the biggest challenges for any Westerner working in China, even people like us who think we're Chinese. And then you get to China and
you're not.
yeah.
Dude, one thing like Will and I both realized real quickly when we got to Beijing was like, we're like Chinese American, we speak Mandarin. They're going to just accept us as one of them. But we quickly realized there are levels to that too, right? And there's like, you're an expat, you're completely clueless. And then there's like the haigui, right? Like the sea turtles coming home. And even they're seen as like, okay, you've been gone a few years. Like you don't really know what's happening on the ground even, right? So you have to be like born and raised mud turtle, whatnot, right? Like that's like, okay, you really are completely ingrained in the system and how things are done.
The sooner you realize it, the happier you are. Because for the first few years, I was like a wannabe local. And number one, the minute you open your mouth, they can tell you're not. Number two is the expectation, even if you try and fake it like you are, and they say things to you and you don't understand because you lack the context, they're going to feel like confused and bewildered. So I just started to embrace the fact that I'm like this ABC living in China and like you take it or leave it. And I'm not going to try and act any differently. But if I'm able to kind of get a little bit more local perspective in the process, then I get that much benefit and there's a premium. Like you're exceeding the expectation. But face value, I'm just going to be like, hey, I'm ABC, so cut me some slack. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. You keep trying, but you realize to your point, like you'll never be seen as one of them, right?
Yeah, which is fine.
You hope to,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm curious, Brian, then coming back to you, what do you think? I mean, I feel like you're kind of understating it, but what do you think made you successful in your endeavors in China, right? Because Will and I both spent time there. And over time, increasingly, it's been more difficult for people like us to stay in China and succeed in China. So what qualities do you think you have or things that you learned over time that allowed you to be successful?
Well, again, like I think you're being too kind to call me successful, but I would call myself a survivor. And really,
Excellent.
the only thing I did was had this willingness and tenacity to stick with it. And I think in some ways in China, that is the secret to success is being willing to 吃苦, right? Is like eat the bitterness because a lot of people only have a certain level of tolerance. A lot of my friends, it's like, I'm cut out, I'm done. Sort of 20, I don't know, 23, 24 years plus in and out of China. But most of that time, 20 years in China really was the result of a real, back to what I said at the beginning, burning curiosity and a passion for learning about China and Chinese culture. That more than just the business. And I don't think I'm particularly successful business wise. Like I should have a few more zeros next to my name, but I have enough to be happy. But the main thing is I've had a really rich experience answering a lot of questions that I've had in my life through the time I've spent there. And everything that I do in China, because I had some really dark times and really challenging moments, which I tend to kind of just push in the back of my mind. If you ask me, everything seems great now in hindsight, but it sucked for many moments. But I would take away from that, like, what am I getting out of this? What am I learning? What questions am I answering? Like the one that Will asked about, like trying to integrate. I had a lot of pain when I'd be hanging out with other Alibaba senior executives and I'd get my ass handed to me in a meeting because I totally missed the cue in terms of what I should be doing or saying and totally humiliated or frustrated. And after you're done licking your wounds, you're like, okay, how am I going to take this and make myself more effective the next meeting? And at the same time, it was like, this is so awesome because I'm actually have this opportunity to be with these people, to learn how to get along with them and also be a part of this story. And that like just kept driving me up till now. And it still drives me because of that passion and curiosity. So I don't think in anything in life, I mean, you guys know this in your own ventures and endeavors, anything in life, you can be fully successful unless you've got that motivation behind you that kind of keeps you going.
But even when you started, well, I'm going to say again, basically the 52nd employee, but over those 15 years, you've been able to cultivate enough of a credibility and enough of a relationship where basically Jack Ma is asking you to be in the room with him at such an important time, right? And so can you just explain how you were able to get in that room over your career and how did you basically build that relationship and cultivate that credibility?
Yeah, I think it, for someone like Jack, it really boiled down to saying what I really thought and believed in. I had the privilege at the beginning to be the young guy in the room, and all the older, more seasoned professionals had probably the pressure of trying to do their job in their mind, make the boss happy. And obviously I wanted to make the boss happy, but I also was like this young and naive guy. And I'm like, well, you can't do that. It's ridiculous. You got to do this. Or look, Jack, I already tried this and I didn't tell you guys, but look what we got. And he's like, oh, he loves that. Right. Whereas if you were some VP at the company, you're going to try and do everything by the book. And I also didn't have the privilege of a business school education back then. I was like an English lit major, pre-med, gone to the tech world, and like I didn't know what I was doing. Whereas like the guys at the top were like McKinsey consultants and like all these ex whatever bankers. And so they were supposed to have all the answers. I wasn't encumbered by the kind of traditional thinking. And I think that's what Jack liked. So when I actually went off to business school, first he's like, congratulations, but are you sure you want to go? I'm like, of course, it's business school. He's like, well, you're not going to learn anything. And I was like, okay, whatever. I'm going to go get my MBA. And then when I came back, surprisingly, after studying and working a bit, he's like, man, Brian, that MBA made you dumber. You're saying these things that are like so ridiculous. I'm like, no, this we learned in business school. He's like, well, that's the problem. And I was kind of, I don't know, dude, this is, how do you know that? Like, I'm going to show you this is the way it's done because this is what we learned. But what he valued was the fact that the old Brian, and he said this, I like the old Brian instead of the new Brian. The old Brian wasn't just blindly following like these theories and these models. We were actually doing things that based on some sort of more down to earth rationale. And the problem in China, let's put this in context. America has had like a business management science for over 150 years. Wharton was established, the Wharton School was established in like the mid 1800s or late 1800s. China only started their modern business kind of revolution like in the 80s. So it's like 40, 50 years of like business knowledge. So there's a lot of things that were being created on the fly and we take that for granted. And you can't just take cookie cutter like MBA stuff and put it into China because actually there's a lot of context to China that isn't considered when you're trying to just apply models. And this is why eBay failed in China. This is why so many Western companies failed in China because they were just trying to template that out. And I think that's what Jack was getting at is like, go back to the fundamentals. And so put that MBA aside, not that it won't be useful at some point, but put it aside right now because that's not where China is. You've got to apply things for the China market.
Digging a little deeper into that, because that's interesting how you were just saying about when you first joined, you were the young guy and guys like Joe Tsai and I hope I'm not butchering the name, but Savio Kwan from GE, right? And all these other key hires that were bringing certain Western best practices that were then, I guess, meshed with some of Jack's own values and vision. What do you think made some of these early employees successful, that they were able to maintain relevance and continue to grow with the company and take on important positions?
Yeah. So these are good questions. Joe brought something that Jack didn't have, which was like kind of this legal and financial expertise. And when you're setting up a company, when you're raising financing, those things are still pretty standard because there's a global standard for that, right? And so Joe's knowledge and expertise in that area was directly relevant and directly applicable. You could say, oh, is there a Chinese way of like structuring a company and raising the funds? No, because it was an international sort of market, right? So you have to abide by the regulations, standards, especially if you're setting up like an international sort of type of business, Cayman Islands, Hong Kong, whatever. So Joe was perfect for that. And he was impeccable in terms of his skills and whatnot. Savio brought a management system from GE to Alibaba, but then adapted it to a Chinese environment. Savio, what's great about him, he's Hong Kong Chinese, educated in the UK, then worked in China for a long time, GE Medical. But Savio understood like Chinese culture. Like he's a big fan of Jin Yong, Louis Cha, and the wuxia kung fu stories. And Jack was a lover of wuxia. And one of the things that they were able to meet eye to eye on is how do you create a company culture that's driven by values, but these values are linked to kind of this Chinese wuxia genre. And I think values as a concept is universal, even though GE had a structure for that. It's universal in terms of motivation, what mission and vision. That's all kind of very human. But what Savio did then was take that and was able to adapt it to fit the environment. And so those two people were very successful because one, the expertise was universal. And two, in the case of Savio, they were able to integrate the Chinese culture as part of it.
Yeah. On the topic of culture, and we talked this over and over in the book about how important that was in terms of really having that, I think top down, everyone believed in the mission. And really that was what kind of kept both culturally and then operationally everyone going and being on the same page. When I was working in China, I'd interface with teams from Ali. And one thing that I was very surprised by was that kind of almost naive or just strong conviction in the company's mission, right? And everyone had their wuxia name and was very bought into that. And that's something that was very surprising to me. They'd be like, oh, don't use WeChat, use Laiwang, right? Like,
Yeah,
come
yeah,
try Laiwang.
yeah.
But it's impressive because, in China, like everyone's pragmatic, right? But these guys really were drinking the Kool-Aid, so to speak, and really bought in. And so to that point, like in terms of the culture, how do you think that was able to sustain, through thick and thin, right? Because company did have these times where they were in a tough spot. And given just kind of the uncertainty, how was management and leadership, how are you guys able to maintain that type of strong cultural unity?
First of all, what's very important is over communicating like the mission of the organization. So people know what they're getting into, why they're joining. And that's like the first step is like anyone who joins the organization is bought into the purpose of the organization. That's a starting point. Then you have these values, and the values are something from day one are inculcated deeply within kind of the staff because they go through this very, very rigorous training. And the training is also very experiential based. So that way they can feel it and they can intellectualize it. After that, it really boils down to how you gear the organization such that you get them enough small wins where they feel pride and confidence in what they're doing by following this system. And then on a larger scale, you have Jack, who's constantly kind of sharing this vision today and beyond. So you kind of know where you're going. So it's like incremental steps lead to the big sort of successes. Along the way, as you're getting that experience, then you start reinforces the belief in this culture makes sense and you believe in it. I think if you didn't have that kind of virtuous cycle, it would sound like a lot of sort of lip service and people would stop believing and they just BS. But I think that's kind of what drove it. And then I think probably equally important is the amount of transparency that senior management provides and how they make these decisions. So when there are mistakes that are made, they admit it and then they will have a conversation openly, either like in a forum, online, or actually a face to face. And that you referred to like that naivety, 很傻很天真, like this very innocent and naive approach. It unleashes, because we're all children at heart in a way. And I mean, I'll tell you, as an American coming out, I was very cynical. It's just like, this is a joke. Like, why we do this stuff? And like, all these people are just, like you said, drinking the Kool-Aid. I left the company 3 times and I went back 3 times because I thought like, oh, there's got to be a better way to do this, or this is kind of like excessive. Because it takes a lot of energy. If you're not into it, you're sitting there like scratching your head, like, what is going on with these people? But once I put down my barriers and just kind of went for it, it just opens up all this additional energy and enthusiasm and motivation. I just like gave in and it was empowering. And we had a lot of foreign staff that started joined through the time of the company. And the ones who did the best were the ones that also put their guard down. I mean, you do ridiculous things at the all hands. You put yourself out there on stage performance wise, but that is an analogy or a reflection of kind of how you conduct yourself in everyday work. And I think when you talk about 很小很天真, innocence and naivety also means you give people the benefit of the doubt. So I think, Lee, in your experience working with these Alibaba people, you were probably also amazed at how generous and committed they were in terms of getting the job done. And I think I've heard this from a lot of people. They say, I know when I'm dealing with an Alibaba person who's even left the company, like I can tell the difference. Like if I'm dealing with someone at Meituan or ByteDance, I can tell if they came from Alibaba because there's this like spirit about them. And I think it's infectious. And that's how I think it was harvested or sort of developed in Alibaba company culture.
Yeah. I mean, it was a breath of fresh air, to be honest. Working with other Chinese companies like Baidu or Tencent, whatever, like, yeah, the Ali employees just had a different vibe to them. And I think that really shone through. I'm a fan of Jing Yong myself. And I noticed you never mentioned in the book what your nickname was. So I'm very curious what you chose and why.
Well, so I was just hoping you wouldn't ask that because it's really embarrassing. People do ask that on occasion. And here's the deal. The reality is that when I joined the first time, it was before they came up with the whole like Jinyong Huaming thing, right? Like the nicknames. And then I left for a few years to go to B school. And that's when like Savio kicked that in, started the whole thing. Because Savio kind of joined, I left just after Savio joined and like the whole system kind of took off. When I joined in 2005 again, I should have chosen a Huaming. And I think I did have one for a short time, but I didn't read Jinyo growing up. It didn't mean a lot to me. And my English name was enough for me, right? Like you have a Chinese name and an English name, and then you have a Huaming, like a nickname. That's 3 names. I'm like, just call me Brian. So clearly I missed out the extra superpowers of the Kung Fu heroes. And to this day, I regret it. So I do not have a Chinese Jinyo nickname.
Really? Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
That's surprising. I thought
Yeah,
everyone.
it is. But the foreigners, like a lot of the foreigners didn't have it because they just used their English names. So
I see.
So when I went to China from America, I had a lot of preconceptions of what was the right thing to do because of all the context I had in America that I was holding on to. I didn't even really realize was context, right? And a lot of things didn't make sense to me in China, and I got very frustrated. And it wasn't until I started to really read Chinese history and read like Chinese philosophy to really have some empathy for what's going on, right? You referenced this a little bit earlier, and also your book, The Tao of Alibaba, references Taoism. And so I was curious, maybe let's just start out with what were some of the things that as you're going on your Chinese philosophy and history journey, what are some of the things that you've learned that helped you empathize and understand China better?
yeah, okay. So there's a few layers to this. One is just the everyday practical development stage of a country as an emerging economy. So you've got that piece going on that China is very much a part of. And then you've got like this political system of communism that you have to deal with. And then on top of that, you've got the cultural, philosophical history. And as I mentioned, to understand China, besides the first two, which are probably are more intellectual, the philosophical part took a lot for me as well to learn. I mean, I'm still learning today, and this is one of the things I want to spend more of my time on now that I have some freedom, is Chinese philosophy, because it's a very different mindset from the West. And it's hard to explain. How do you explain something, Taoism? Like I think the first verse of the Tao Te Ching is, the Tao is that which cannot be explained. How do you explain that in logical terms to a Western person? With that first line, you're just like, well, then what's the point of reading the rest of this book? And then you've got all these other concepts like in Taoism, like Wu Wei, non-action, and how to do something through non-action. That's completely illogical. So I spent time actually going around talking to like Tai Chi masters, Taoist people. I went to Singapore. There's some academics there I think are some of the most astute at being able to explain Chinese philosophy in Western terms. So one of the crazy things about Taoism or Chinese philosophy is the whole health, like TCM, traditional Chinese medicine, is based on a lot of Chinese philosophy. Okay, yin yang and all this links to Taoism. So the philosophy and the health practice are like very integrated. And I asked this professor, I said, why is it that people can't scientifically explain Chinese medicine? He said, because the problem is it's all using allegories to explain how the systems work. They're using stories. They're not using scientific method. So you even have the system to explain it. So when it came to writing the book, I had to do a deep dive into like Taoism, but I realized how little I understood about it. And I studied Chinese philosophy when I was in college, but the problem was I was trying to intellectualize it. And so I couldn't understand it. And so only through my time at Alibaba was I able to then apply like real world experience to the Chinese philosophy. And then when I realized is that Alibaba represents, and Jack in particular, represents a lot of the Taoist principles put into action. And so in my book, I talk about the Tao of Alibaba has 3 principles. And this is a complete oversimplification of the philosophy, but it allows people to understand the principles. Number 1 is Taoism represents the path or the way. So everything and everyone has a natural path in the universe. And that is sort of dictated by the world around you, but it's also in some ways predestined. The second is you need to think about yourself in the context of harmony with your environment. So the key is to really figure out how you fit into the larger universe and can go with the flow with the least amount of resistance. And that's what a lot of Taoism talks about. And then 3, probably most confusing for people, is this paradox of contradictions, this embracing the paradox. And in the West, it's either black or white, big or small, and profit or non-profit, binary. But in Asian and Taoist belief, it's both. And I talk about that in like Savio's explanation about yin yang and management philosophy. And Jack also says this all the time. I use this Harvard speech as an example. Jack said, Alibaba is successful because we have no money, no technology, and no business plan. That's very Taoist, right? You can deconstruct that. But to the Western listener, they think that is completely ridiculous. Like that makes no sense. And so the sooner that you can kind of embrace these three principles, the easier it is to understand how Alibaba works as a company. And I think using a company is a very effective way to explain a philosophical principle. But if I want to break it down in the simplest terms, I use a Bruce Lee movie. So Bruce Lee in Enter the Dragon, remember he's talking to that student, he says, kick me, right? And then the kid tries to kick him and he says, what was that, an exhibition? Try again. And then he does the whole thing. And then Bruce Lee says, how did that feel? And then the guy says, let me think. And he hits him. He says, don't think, feel. It's like a finger pointing to the moon. And then he hits the kid again. It's like, don't concentrate on the finger or you'll miss all the heavenly glory. Okay, so what does that mean? The Western approach oftentimes focuses too much on the finger, which is the means of how to do it. But what you should be focusing on is the heavenly glory, like kind of the bigger picture, the end goal. And Taoism talks about how we focus too much on kind of the tactics and we miss the bigger picture. And so you can say, oh, well, your book is all about like management tactics. Like, how is that Taoism? Well, the point is the tactics point you to the bigger picture. And the bigger picture in my book is fulfilling a purpose, right? Using a business to fulfill a purpose. That is kind of the Tao. And you need both elements. You need tactics and you need vision, mission and vision. So this book has been a journey, not just of talking about Alibaba company, but about discovering Chinese philosophy. And I think that this starts to permeate in many other aspects of our lives, both in terms of how we as people of Asian culture see the world around us, our families, our friends, our community. And I think even though we're very American, I would argue many of us who live in America today retain kind of that Asian culture, which is why we value family so much. But if you look at kind of China or Confucian kind of cultured countries, or even Japanese culture, which had a lot of Chinese influence, like Chan Zen is like from the Chan Buddhist philosophy, they think of themselves as a part of a larger world, an ecosystem, so to speak. And so if you look at the artwork, for example, this is a big difference. The West tends to have individual portraits of people, whereas Asian art often focuses on landscapes because they're looking at kind of the bigger picture and the human being is a much smaller piece. So that's all about mindset. And that links to the Asian thinking and the philosophy. So we can go on and on talking
No,
about
that was
this.
super helpful. And
Yeah.
it's pretty awesome, actually, that how you laid out the book is describing a company, but it really is describing like a philosophy, which is great. One of the things that you talk about and what the book is based on is that in 2016, Jack Ma tapped you to create this unique internal training program to prepare Alibaba for globalization, meaning that you had to take this Chinese way of doing business and philosophy and train non-Chinese people and get them to buy into that philosophy, right? And so can you tell us a little bit about that experience?
Yeah. So we had kind of finished the whole roadshow and the globalization stuff was really in full kind of motion. And I think what Jack started to realize as he started to deploy these programs is like, we don't have enough bench strength to actually fill the ranks for Alibaba to truly go global. And he said, what we need to do is start developing the next generation. So I said, Brian, why don't you go do that? I was like, really? I don't know anything about this. He's like, well, go create a program. So Jack from day one has always been about education. He also has been very focused. Like from the first year we started Alibaba, he had an internal training program for the salespeople or all the employees by then Ali. It's like, how do you get Alibaba to last 100 years? But we didn't have anything for the international people, particularly leadership training. So I think he asked me to do this because I was one of the longest like serving foreign staff. I had been through the different businesses in terms of my work, my management experience, but also I had gone with him and seen how he does things. And I think he'll choose individuals to be his chief of staff or special assistant so they can learn from what he does. Like Eddie Wu, the present CEO of Alibaba, did the same thing as Jack's assistant for like a year, just literally traveled with him everywhere. And then I think what Jack hopes is that you're going to take that knowledge and put it into the program or put it into practice. So that's basically what he asked me to do. And I spent a lot of time thinking about this because I've done programs like leadership programs like at McGraw-Hill Companies. That was one with the chairman, and he wanted to train 4 MBAs to become future leaders at the McGraw-Hill Companies. And I've done other leadership programs, whether it's in B School or these other like organizations. And so I tried to integrate some of those concepts, but really what it boiled down to is how do we teach the management ethos and leadership thinking of Alibaba in a structured way? And a lot of that program was the basis of my book. So if you couldn't attend the program in Alibaba, you can read the book, and a lot of it is in there.
One of the friends of the podcast, San Eng, I asked him what I should ask you, and he was really impressed by the way that you not only just follow trends, but you're a very thoughtful and systematic thinker before you make decisions. And I would love to learn that process for you. And there's a couple of examples that I have here that I'm just going to read out. So leaving management consulting to join the San Francisco mayor's office as a special assistant, and leaving a prestigious leadership development program at McGraw-Hill after being one of the 4 top MBAs to be personally selected and mentored by Terry McGraw to return to Alibaba in 2005. San said that you spend a lot of time talking to a lot of different people, ask a lot of questions, and then you make the right choice. Could you just take us through that process, how you do it, and how you're able to build such an illustrious career that you have?
I think that for me, life has always been about asking questions and seeking answers and trying to live a life of meaning. One of the books influenced me early on, obviously, many people have read it, but like Siddhartha, right? Like how his journey towards enlightenment. So he just did everything he could think of to kind of experience things. And then also, there are a few other influences in my life that said my thesis in college was on Walden, Henry David Thoreau, and he talked about sucking the marrow of life, living a meaningful life. And so that's the principle I've gone with. But I always want to speak to people that I really respect to understand how they see things. Then I'll usually have like a purpose or a goal or a conviction, and then I'll test that. And so the reason why I spend a lot of time talking to people is to get the perspective. And then I also try and think of worst case scenarios. So making non-traditional decisions, I think, are exciting for me. I don't like to go with the flow, not go with the flow, but go with like the mainstream trend, because without questioning it, not that I haven't done that in some parts of my life, but I also think you've got to figure out your own path. But when you deviate, you need to think about the worst case scenarios. And so that's how I mitigate the risk, or I acknowledge the risk and I acknowledge that I'm willing to accept that consequence. So going out to Alibaba in 1999, a lot of people are like, what the heck were you thinking? Because I could have stayed in the Bay Area. I could have either stayed at the mayor's office, or I could have gone and applied to like Google or whatever and done just fine. Like that life would have been great. And who knows, maybe it'd be a different place right now. But I felt there was such a burning need to get back to China to be part of that. That was like an emotional thing. And if it's emotional, that's also very important to acknowledge. But then the logic has to say, okay, let's just say you fail miserably in 2 years. What's the worst thing that could happen? Well, you've gotten 2 years of more experience in China, and you've gotten exposure to the internet. You're still employable, right? The MBA thing was a hard decision because I really didn't want to leave China. I felt like I'd be missing out. But then the MBA, that's a very conservative choice, right? But then what's the consequence of that? Well, it's missed opportunity. It's opportunity cost. So I think that's how I approach life. But I do think that you need to listen to your heart as much as your mind and balance those. And I think a lot of entrepreneurs have this dilemma. Like if you look at the logic behind being an entrepreneur, it doesn't make a lot of logical sense because your chance of failure is very high. But a lot of people, I mean, including yourselves, you can ask yourself this, like a lot of entrepreneurs I know can't imagine themselves working for anyone else. Like it just emotionally is like very, very difficult for them to accept. And so you make that choice, but then you have to also know what the consequences are and be prepared for that. So I think that for me, the rest of my life is going to be living the same way, and that I have to have a conviction, a curiosity, as we talked about at the beginning. And then I can't imagine a life that doesn't have those elements. That's an interesting life. And I look at the people who live a long time, who have that fire in their eye. Like Jack definitely has this. It's like this desire to just go out and keep experiencing things and learning new things. And that is probably the best motivation in your journey.
One of the vehicles I think that you've been able to do this is Radii. You're the founder and chairman of Radii. I think it most probably puts you in a lot of different conversations and rooms that you probably normally wouldn't get. When I found out you were the founder of Radii, like I was so excited, mainly just because I didn't know that you're connected to it. But basically, after I came back from China, I was trying to find a way to connect back to like Chinese culture. And one of the ways that I did that was through Rap of China. And I was just downloading the Rap of China episodes and like watching like Jin was on there and then all these different rappers. And I was like, learning about the Chinese hip hop space. I had nobody to talk to about it because nobody else watched it. I was the only one who was watching it and I had nobody else to talk to it. When I Googled anything about the results, anything like that, the only thing that I found was Radii. And they're talking about Rap of China. And so I have a very strong affinity because at least I was like not the only person that really was that into Rap of China. Really, there's like a whole like publication that was talking about it. And so maybe you could just explain what Radii is and why you started it.
Well, that's awesome. Well, I'm glad that you really found it useful and the content relevant to your own interests. Because Radii, I started in 2017, so it's almost 6 years ago, but it was a kind of a side project. So all the stuff we were talking about at Alibaba was the foundation of my perspective that there is a huge disconnect in understanding between the East and West. And that's not just on the geopolitical side or the tech kind of innovation side, but also on the culture, youth culture side. There was so much happening in China that I thought was so interesting that was not being talked about in America. Like every time I'd go back to the US, I'd have to explain like, what the hell, what this, the clubs are just amazing. Compared to New York, it's equal, if not more interesting. Or the music scene, like there is hip hop and the way that they've adapted things is on par. And how do you explain this to your friends in a way that's going to catch their interest? And so I said, let's just set up a media platform that can showcase these things, provide a window into the new China, so to speak. Like I'm the last guy to know about a lot of these things. So I hired a team of young men and women. And, you know, the Rap of China stuff that you read was written by some of the most passionate writers and I don't know, even producers that are in the music scene. And like they're deep in it. And how do we showcase that? Through writing, through video, through mini documentaries. So we cover 5 different areas like entertainment, digital life, food and travel, wellness, and fashion. Like we cover all these topics. And the thought is that these are things that young people are also going to be interested in. But let's provide a window into China, but present it in a way or provide a window into China and Chinese kind of diaspora now, because we've kind of branched out from just China to just show kind of this whole Asian sort of youth culture scene, but present it in a way that's accessible. Because the problem is that a lot of this stuff exists, but it's in a different language, or it's just like not presented in a way that people see the relevance. Like you fortunately saw the relevance because you lived in China for some time. But like, how do you explain what the Rap of China is to like some guy in California? You have to use references that they can understand. And so that's what we're aspiring to do. We're still around and we've got really active social media. We do mini documentaries. And I think we're going to really try and just increase our productivity in terms of the kind of content we put out, but also shift more kind of the video side because written is good, but then like to really bring it alive, you have to kind of have the multimedia sort of angle and also distribute it in channels that people actually are using from that demographic.
One of the most recent pieces that I saw was your panel that you moderated on Warriors, a TV show, which is basically about Chinatown in 1870. And you brought on an amazing panel of guests. One of them is like, I'm a big fan of is Carl Za, who is incredible, lately, like knows history. It's a really great conversation because you basically brought like the context of what was happening then to basically what's happening now. And you kind of related everything and it was great. Another one that I've seen was in person. This is in Singapore. And he brought on Heng Chi, the ambassador at large with Singapore's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And he brought in a panel from James Lowe from Singapore, Clifton Chang from Los Angeles, and Michael Sung from Hong Kong, right? And I think you do an incredible job of putting these panels together, bringing different perspectives, and really creating like that conversation. How do you think about putting together good panels, and how do you prepare?
Well, I put together panels based on topics I think are going to be useful for the listeners. And the listeners generally, I think of are people like myself who are like Western raised and have a curiosity in not just Asia, but the world as a whole. I try and make these topics relevant to a broad audience so that people care. And the individuals that I try and bring on are people that I have met or have personal relationships with, or feel like I want to learn more about them. And I think it's very important in those conversations to kind of have a certain rapport with them so they feel comfortable to share their views in a way that's going to be interesting to the listeners. But I hope that people will walk away from the conversations enlightened and hopefully like inspired on a level to take some action. Like I never like to just have a conversation for the sake of a conversation. I usually try and add an element to like, okay, now that we know this, so what? What are you going to do with it? And I really enjoy doing these. I think I should do more. I appreciate your feedback on it. But for me, it's like really satisfying to be able to bring that knowledge to the surface where other people can really partake in it.
One of the things that stand out to me, just I'm not just from the panels, whether it's your history with San Francisco Mayor Willie Brown or Terry McGraw from McGraw-Hill to Jack Ma and Joe Tsai, how have you been able to build these types of relationships with people at that level? How do you think about building relationships and how can we do that as well?
I think my secret is having a bigger purpose and then finding people that can help inform me. So Willie Brown, because oftentimes I would be very shy to talk to these people unless I had something bigger to motivate me, like a burning desire to talk to someone in a certain area or space or profession so I can learn. It's purely, again, for the curiosity. So with Willie Brown, I was very curious about how does the public sector change people's lives for the better? What do politicians do to improve the society that they're responsible for? Okay. In the case of Terry McGraw, I was in great admiration of what he and his family have created as a company. Because most people, like when you graduate from Wharton, you're like, why would you go to McGraw-Hill companies to work? Like you should go work for a hedge fund, or you should go work at an investment bank or whatever. And for me, McGraw-Hill was an amazing company because the industries they play on are the pillars of building a modern society: media, education, and financial services. And I said, well, this is a company that can help change society. So how does Terry as an individual think? And so that's why I was very excited about taking on that, especially because he was willing to mentor young people and help nurture them. He's a great man. And a lot of people that worked at the company have been there for like over 20, 30 years for the same reason. And then with Jack Ma, it's like, how does an English teacher who has this great aspiration to create a world-changing business that happens to be from China achieve that? So every time I would go back to the company, it was like with an intent to learn how Jack is doing this. And so when I talk to him or I talk to Joe, I have like a million questions I want to ask them while I'm with them. And I'm sure it gets annoying at times, probably particularly annoying with Jack when we're on the road and I keep asking him stuff. But at the same time, I think that they see that I'm genuinely invested in going on this journey with them. And so the next person that I meet or I follow or want to work with, it's going to be the same dynamic. Like these efforts and initiatives need to be genuine and sincere. And people sense that. Like my friends are friends for life. The reason why I still can like contact these individuals is because I think that there is a relationship that's been created that is genuine and sincere. And I'd like to think that that's how I approach life. And that's how I would approach things with the people that engage me. It shows. Like if you're doing something just to go through the motions or you're using them as a way to get to the next thing, I think people sense that. The people have to be the end in itself in terms of developing a relationship that is genuine for the purposes that you set out for, like wanting to truly get to know them. In the same way that we're having this conversation, right? Like I assume you guys genuinely care about things that I've done, what I think. That's substantive, right? As opposed to going through the motions. So
it's very obvious that one of your biggest high purposes right now, based on things that you're doing, is US-China relations. And you care really deeply about that, right? And so can you just tell us what that means to you and why you're working so hard at it?
Well, I mean, like you guys, I have a lot at stake in this relationship because I'm American by nationality and I'm Chinese by cultural heritage. I've also spent time in both places and appreciate what both countries and societies can do in terms of creating better lives for its people. I also recognize that the combination of constructive collaboration between US and China can yield very positive and important outcomes for the whole world, humanity at large. And it just so happens it's the first and second largest economies in the world. I think what really frustrates me is the amount of time and resources spent on trying to counter one another as opposed to try and lift each other up or just lift yourself up relative to the other one. I know competition is a primal instinct. Dominance is a political dynamic, but there are other ways to approach this such that we don't lose sight of the bigger picture. Because I think what we're facing right now, we're all experiencing this, is existential threats that require the cooperation between both countries and both countries' people. The intellectual capital that can be unleashed to solve these problems between US and China is of utmost importance when we're thinking about things like disease and climate change. I was just thinking these last 12 months, two areas that I grew up in as a child, have very fond memories, have been decimated by natural disasters. One obviously is Maui. I used to go every Christmas for 25 years to Kaanapali, which is just north of Lahaina. And we spent a lot of time in Lahaina because that's the most happening, historic, and beautiful waterfront. It used to be the capital of the Indian Kingdom, the Hawaiian Kingdom. And by the way, it has a lot of Chinese roots to it too. Sun Yat-sen's brother actually had plantations on Maui. And there is a Chinese temple that was on Maui Front Street that represented kind of all the Chinese immigrants that were there at the early time, all burnt to the ground. Probably close to 1,000 lives would probably be lost when they counted. The other place that I grew up on is in Santa Cruz, Aptos Beach. There's a beach called Sea Cliff Beach. And there's a fishing pier there that's connected to a concrete boat that comes from World War I. That concrete boat just happens to be called SS Palo Alto, which is where I grew up. But more importantly, this concrete boat was the historic site that a lot of people in the community have memories, completely decimated by storms. The pier is going to be torn down and the boat is basically, it's been a relic there, but it's destroyed. So this environmental damage, if you can't stop it, maybe you could slow it down. But if you can't slow it down, you need to figure out how to protect your communities from these disasters. And that involves a lot of collaboration in terms of technology, but also data sharing. Like, how do you predict weather patterns and then create systems that we can work together to address these things? And US and China are at the center of all this.
Yeah, I think being Chinese American and being so respectful of our heritage, I think both Will and I have family in the States and in Taiwan as well. I think for me, I just want to also reiterate the appreciation for the work that you have been doing, perhaps in this next chapter in your life and career, because a lot of the Chinese-US relations, whether it's panels, I know there's a series of things you've done. I can't even name them all, but like the bamboo ceiling panels you've done, the past with FS Strong, this is very central to all of us. And I think it is very important for our generation to try to be the conduit for so many, whether it's Americans or people around the world that are perhaps like uneducated about everything that you've been talking about in your book. And I know we kind of glossed over, we didn't dive deep into AGI and all the work that you did there. But for people that haven't had a chance, go grab Brian's book, The Tao of Alibaba. But it's amazing the things that he was able to create and to help entrepreneurs all around the world, from Africa, Rwanda to Malaysia, et cetera. So the list goes on.
Can I chime in on that? I appreciate you bringing that up. AGI being the Alibaba program, global initiatives that we created to train entrepreneurs in emerging markets. I just did a class last night, about 650 people from 50 countries, everywhere from, like you said, Africa to Latin America to Middle East, Southeast Asia. I feel passionate about that initiative because we're basically trying to encourage entrepreneurs who are using technology to create businesses, but give them purpose in the businesses they create. So gear them towards creating their business to solve social problems. And the reason why I think this is a unique program is because we're taking it from the vantage point of a country that started with nothing, that built what we see today as the world's largest digital economy. Now, a lot of people will go to Y Combinator and all these other programs out of Silicon Valley. But what I found very interesting is that a lot of these entrepreneurs, and particularly in the emerging markets, have a strong affinity to the China sort of story because their conditions in their countries are much closer to what China started with versus Palo Alto, right? Or Silicon Valley. And so they take cues not just from the Valley, but also from companies like Alibaba's experience, because they believe that they might have a better chance at doing this because a guy like Jack Ma was able to be successful. And there are plenty of cases that I can highlight, and it's in the book, like you said, of these entrepreneurs who came to our training saw what was happening in China and said, oh my gosh, I've got this great technology, but how do I apply this to a greater purpose? So they'll apply it to like the farming communities in Malaysia. Or this one guy, Wilson Bay in Malaysia, decided to use his insurance tech business to actually insure the delivery drivers of the food delivery businesses and the street vendors who are making food on the street. They're not insured. They're not within a safety net. And suddenly when he shifted his business from like serving the elite businesses to what they call the B40, the bottom 40% of society, not only did he solve a social problem, he also had a whole new business approach that is taking off and helping this community while being successful business. And that's exactly what Alibaba represents. But what they need are role models. And so I think it's so cool to like be able to go to these places and meet these entrepreneurs who get completely inspired or jazzed up by the examples we present. And then they go and they do something that will totally impress you and everyone else, including themselves. Like, I don't cue them on this. Like, Ryan, the last time I went to your training, I totally changed my mindset. It's like, really? Just that? They're like, yeah, because I didn't know it was possible. So that's like what we got to do. And let me just say, like, I'm really excited that you guys are taking the initiative to bring stories like mine to light, because this is like a team effort. It's also multi-generational effort. Like, I'm kind of getting up there in age and we need to pass the baton, and we need more people like you guys to activate our community. Like, I just think we need to just make ourselves more aware. Part of it is just being aware gives you more options to take action. And one thing I'll end with is, well, I mean, we don't have to end here, but just to kind of conclude my answer, is that sometimes when you go out and you see the world and you interact with different people, you realize how lucky and fortunate we are to have the things that we've been given or the access that we have. And it's our responsibility to use that to kind of spread the opportunities as best we can, however we can. Maybe it's through venture capital, maybe it's through teaching, maybe it's through podcasts. But there are enough resources in this world today to feed everyone, to provide access to information and these opportunities. But the problem is just getting them connected and the distribution of all of this. So anyhow.
That was great. I appreciate it. And Brian, thank you for sharing your incredible journey. You're an inspiration to a lot of us, including me and Lee, and really appreciate you giving kind of the insight in terms of just your story. And so thank you so much for your generosity. Really appreciate it.
Great. No, thank you guys. You asked some really insightful questions, and I've had a great time having this conversation. So thank you, and keep up the great work.
Thank you. See you later.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you so much for listening until the end. If you've enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. It'll help more people like you find us. You can find more about us on wild.show, WLD.SHOW. Please subscribe to our newsletter or DM us on Twitter. We'd love to get to know you.